You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Hywel Davis. The trial of Bradley Manning, the US soldier who leaked hundreds of thousands of classified documents to WikiLeaks. To government prosecutors, Manning is a traitor who endangered the lives of his fellow soldiers. But he's been hailed as a hero by some, who say he's a man of principle, motivated by a desire to shed light on US military and diplomatic misdeeds abroad. To discuss the case, I'm joined by Professor John Gearson, Director of the Centre for Defence Studies at King's College London, and by Andy Worthington, a British journalist and head of the Close Guantanamo campaign. Professor John Gearson, one of the key points of the prosecution case against Bradley Manning is that he's damaged American interests and possibly put lives at risk. Is there much evidence of that?
Yes, it's very interesting. For historians such as myself, reading the cables, I was reading just 20 years earlier than I would normally read the material that will soon find its way into archives and will be released into the public domain. But the important difference is the ability, A, to have distance, to put into context, but B, not to influence current events. And I think the tricky thing about Bradley Manning is he appears, from the reports we've heard so far from the case, to have known what he was doing and to have talked about his unfettered access to hundreds of thousands of documents and what would one do if one had this access. So this wasn't an act of a totally naive person who's found something. This was somebody who knew the access that he had, was fairly computer literate, and took a decision to exploit the opportunity afforded by his position to use that information. And I think one of the reasons why the prosecution appears maybe to some people outside the United States as harsher than we would have expected is simply that scale. You know, this is completely beyond the scale of the Pentagon papers or any release before. And it is very unlikely that Bradley Manning had much knowledge of most of the material that he leaked. He probably didn't read it, and there was only limited discrimination on his part, and it's still not clear how much discrimination there was on the part of WikiLeaks. And that's the difference, I think, between previous cases where newspapers and broadcasting organisations have often demonstrated themselves as painfully aware of the obligations of insight into secret material.
I mean, he did try and offer it to newspapers before he eventually went round to WikiLeaks. But is there much evidence that the actual real damage has been lost, real damage has been caused, rather, and lives perhaps lost?
Generally, it seems that those who've wanted to think ill of the United States military have used the information to confirm their beliefs. Whether people who otherwise would have been neutral have changed, I don't think there's much evidence to show that as yet. As for the cable traffics, I think they are embarrassing and can be quite significant. There are certain things that came out that really governments would not want to be reported. And I would suppose, let's remember, he was an intelligence analyst. You know, this was not somebody who was working in the outer reaches of the armed forces. Intelligence is about trust, and it's about discretion. And I certainly think that America will find it harder to get people to be as candid as they would like if they don't believe that information will be held confidentially, albeit that there is no such thing as absolute security.
Andy Worthington, do you think that the Obama administration is trying to make a scapegoat, in a way, of Bradley Manning in an attempt to sort of say to other people in the future, look, you better not do this?
Yeah, I think there must absolutely be an element of trying to scare people off from doing it, because it is embarrassment on such a colossal scale. But, you know, to be trying to claim that he's aiding some kind of enemy, it seems to me to be overkill, and I would very much hope that that's not that we're not going to see Bradley Manning convicted on that, because what he has done is embarrass the United States. But I think, you know, there are different elements of what he's done that's worth separating out. So if you look at his release of the documents relating to the Afghan and Iraq wars, then, you know, recently I was with Ben Griffin. Now, Ben Griffin is a former SAS soldier who became a conscientious objector. He had no hesitation in saying that Bradley Manning is the single most significant anti-war protester that he has ever encountered, because he leaked so much information revealing the truth, as he sees it, of the horrors of war, stuff that the United States wanted hidden, war crimes that were not being discussed. So, you know, there's a perspective on that which I think is clear to make, and that you see that somebody disobeys their orders, the requirements of their job, because of this compulsion to expose the horrible truth of war. I think you can make that argument. What he's doing with the cables, obviously, is that he undertook this perspective whereby he wanted to open up America's secret dealings, diplomatic dealings, to outside scrutiny. And I think that the argument can be made that in certain closed regimes, the release of those documents was extremely useful to people who didn't know the inside workings of their governments. But obviously, in other ways, we could say that there were so many documents that it must have been embarrassing. My particular field of expertise is the Guantanamo files. And actually, those are very interesting because although they don't contain all the classified information, and then they're kind of collection of all kinds of bits of supposed intelligence. What they do is they actually provide names of the people who made statements mainly about their fellow prisoners. And many of these statements are extremely unreliable. And it provides a basis for understanding something about Guantanamo, which the Bush administration wanted hidden, and which I believe, is of massive public importance to this day. And I would commend him absolutely for doing that. So, I can see we have these three different points of view about which documents he released and what significance that they had. But the case above all, to me, is that, yes, he embarrassed the United States. Yes, he needs disciplining. But let's not let this spiral out of control and make this man a disproportionate victim of something. He's not an enemy. He wasn't trying to aid the enemy.
Aiding the enemy is what he's being charged at under the Espionage Act, of course, which is the law. If he's convicted, he'll face life without parole. So what you're saying is that he's broken some rules, but the higher truth is more important, perhaps.
Well, I think that's the case because I think some of what he released was in the public interest to know, and in that case, when somebody is a whistleblower, it doesn't matter. The rules are always that you're not supposed to do that. If he felt compelled to do that, he's asking us to judge whether we thought that was appropriate. In many of the things that he did, I think that was entirely appropriate, yes.
Interested in talking with you, Professor John Gisson, about the legacy of the Bradley Manning leak and trial. What will come of this? Do you think some intelligence operatives will be much more cagey about what they say?
Well, I think clearly the United States is going to have to demonstrate that it doesn't allow very junior ranks access to this level of information and the ability to copy it. For many years, other countries were accused by the United States of being more leaky than the United States, and here we have an internal leak of epic proportions. Where things, I think, will change from this whole decade that we've gone through is the ability for people in the intelligence world to have an access route outside their line of management where they can express concerns. And that's something that certainly came out of the British inquiry into the WMD affair in Iraq, where the Butler inquiry recommended having a professional head of intelligence that analysts could go to outside their line management to express concerns. Not obviously putting it into the public domain in this case, but rather to inform the policy process and to avoid mistakes and to avoid groupthink. And I think those things are coming out of this. Whether mass releases of data to the public in the form of WikiLeaks is fundamentally going to change anything, I don't know. I think what's really changing information, of course, is the connectivity of everybody through their smartphones, and the fact that information is no longer the preserve of the authorities. And I think that will change the intelligence business as well as the public's access to it.
Yes, I mean, one of the most shocking things that was uncovered was that video of the killing of the two Reuters cameramen, and that was obviously secret military video, but it was put on news stations all across the world. Absolutely. Although, again, we don't know what had preceded the 30 minutes before that 2-minute clip that was shown. And, I think it's problematic to label this necessarily as something that was an act that should not have taken place versus something that was criminal in nature. But clearly we would like to see, I suppose, due process where there is evidence enough to follow it. Andy Worthington, are you slightly surprised by this trial? I mean, we have had the Obama administration using the espionage twice as much as every single president preceding him. He used it 6 times. All the other presidents in history have only used it 3 times. Are you surprised and shocked by the Obama administration's attitude towards Bradley Manning?
Well, I'm not in the sense that that we've been discussing the reasons why there's particular overkill in Bradley Manning's case of a leak of a large amount of information. It also is obviously something that involves WikiLeaks. It involves certain parts of the United States administration wanting to go after this particular intermediary between the whistleblower and the media that we've had. That's quite a modern thing. One thing that seems to be missing in all of this is the role of the media. You know, whatever Bradley Manning did in making information available and whatever WikiLeaks did in hosting it, it was then disseminated and it was front page news in the mainstream media in the United States and in Europe for a very, very long time. They made a lot of money out of it. They made a news agenda out of it. So if Bradley Manning is guilty of something, does that not mean that you know, this should spread to the media's responsibility as well? And I think the media took the point of view, as they have done with whistleblowers, that they were doing something in the public good. I'd like to see the mainstream media defend Bradley Manning a little bit more than they're doing, and WikiLeaks as being the intermediary, because I think that all of these things are very connected.
Because we have had WikiLeaks are being, as you say, being prosecuted. If Bradley Manning had gone to the New York Times, then the threat is that they would be the people being prosecuted here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the media I think, has been scared into it because of the pursuit of Bradley Manning and because of the obvious intention of pursuing Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, has been scared into thinking that maybe the United States government is going to come after them. I think their obligation is to stand on the pulpit and say, no, what we were doing was in the public good. That's what leaks are about, and that's why the media publicises information that's made available by whistleblowers, because it is in the international and national interest for that to happen. So, you know, I think I'd like to hear them speak up a little bit more about what's going on.
And some of the revelations that came out were fairly shocking, weren't they? The US ignored abuse of prisoners by Iraqi security forces. Clinton ordered US diplomats to spy on UN officials. Pressure being put on Germany not to prosecute CIA agents, as well as the US special forces working with the Pakistani military, as well as the stuff from Afghanistan and Iraq as well. Is there a way of getting this information out without these leaks of classified information there?
I don't know. I mean, the United States needs to be assessing, obviously, you know, this has been discussed, needs to be assessing who has access to what information, as well as, you know, needs to stand back and review the process of classification. Is there a process of over-classification? Certainly, you know, one thing that we're missing out in here as well is that the very pinnacle of top-secret information, none of this was available to Bradley Manning, and nor was it leaked by him. So, you know, that's something that maybe the prosecutors are not putting across. But the United States needs to evaluate these things, how it's doing things, who has access to information.
Professor Gearson, there's meant to be 2 million people who have access to classified information in the United States. Is that just too many?
I mean, I think each country has to make its own decisions. Any classification system and any system of vetting people is open to abuse, but also can often stand in the way of producing good policy, which is, after all, what countries want. And so the problem with vetting and classification is that people with good ideas who aren't classified aren't able to have the discussion sometimes. And I think that we have had a period where those insiders, and I mean people at the policy level in ministries, have felt chastened and unable to express concerns about policies in a way that perhaps is unusual. Disloyal is a very strong word, but being off message, and this is part of the whole news agenda cycle and the pressure that our modern media puts on policymakers, means that you can't risk anyone sounding as if they've expressed concerns about something. Now, if WikiLeaks and Manning have revealed the fact that there are a range of opinions within governments, that's no bad thing.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much to my guest here in London, Professor John Gearson, Director of the Centre for Defence Studies at King's College London, and Andy Worthington, British journalist and author of the book The Guantanamo Files. To discuss the case, I'm joined by Professor John Gearson, Director of the Centre for Defence Studies at King's College London, and by Andy Worthington, a British journalist and head of the Close Guantanamo campaign. Professor John Gearson, one of the key points of the prosecution case against Bradley Manning is that he's damaged American interests and possibly put lives at risk. Is there much evidence of that?
Yes, it's very interesting for historians such as myself.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Hywel Davis. The trial of Bradley Manning, the US soldier who leaked hundreds of thousands of classified documents to WikiLeaks. To government prosecutors, Manning is a traitor who endangered the lives of his fellow soldiers. But he's been hailed as a hero by some, who say he's a man of principle, motivated by a desire to shed light on US military and diplomatic misdeeds abroad.
He appears, from the reports we've heard so far from the case, to have known what he was doing and to have talked about his unfettered access to hundreds of thousands of documents and what would one do if one had this access. So this wasn't an act of a totally naive person who's found something. This was somebody who knew the access that he had, was myself reading the cables. I was reading just 20 years earlier than I would normally read the material that will soon find its way into archives and will be released into the public domain. But the important difference is the ability, A, to have distance, to put into context, but B, not to influence current events. And I think the tricky thing about Bradley Manning is he's fairly computer literate and took a decision to exploit the opportunity afforded by his position to use that information. And I think one of the reasons why the prosecution appears maybe to some people outside the United States as harsher than we would have expected is simply that scale. This is completely beyond the scale of the Pentagon papers